The following presentation is part of the Technology and the Corporation Conference Series, sponsored by MIT's Industrial Liaison Program.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Eduardo. Es un placer estar aquí con ustedes. Yo comparto el sentimiento de Carl antes, que Madrid es una de las ciudades más favoritas en todo el mundo. Así que muchas gracias para tenernos aquí. And that is the end of my Spanish. Now I will shift to my native language. I'm from a slightly different beast. I think every lab and every department within MIT is distinct and different and a little weird, and we like weird at MIT. But the Media Lab's a little bit weirder as well, and that's because it's described as an anti-disciplinary institution. The idea is that it's not just that it has multiple disciplines, but that it actually rejects the idea of a discipline itself. And so this is this idea of trying to find innovation in the spaces between the economics department and the engineering department, or the law department and the management department. And why does this matter for blockchain? Because I see the blockchain as an enabling platform for everything. And we tend to think of it in narrow terms as either an IT solution or a financial solution, because it began with Bitcoin, right? But really it's this, given that we live in this digital economy, and we've heard this morning about how we are moving more and more rapidly into where everything is being digitized, and you have to have digital change agents in every single company. The digital economy is our economy now. So this is a technology that is going to change the underlying foundation of the internet and therefore of the digital economy, and therefore it requires input from every single discipline. We need to figure out what the legal framework of this is. We need to figure out what the economics are. We need to get the technology and the security right. We need to work on culture. We need to work on social structures and social organizational theory. It's a really complicated thing. There's a lot of work to be done, and that's kind of what we're trying to do, at least be part of the solution at the Digital Currency Initiative that I work for. I'm a senior advisor there. I was formerly a journalist, and so again, I think this fits with this. I'm not an academic by training. I do lecture in this, but I come at this from a generalist's background. I'm a former journalist, as I said, covering economics and global economics. In fact, the last time I was in Madrid, I was here writing about your housing crisis back in 2012. So I came interested in blockchain because I saw it as a way to address the fundamental problems that underlie so many of the crises and the challenges that our society has faced pretty much since the last crisis of 2008, right? So this is where I come from. This is my perspective. So the presentation I'm going to give you is a broad, overarching. I'm not going to dig deep into the weeds of how the blockchain works, but I'm going to give you hopefully a sense of why it matters and where we need to go with it. And just before I start up, I'll just note that I wouldn't mind a show of hands. Who feels like they do understand the basics of what a blockchain is at this stage? Okay, it's pretty impressive. About half, right? About a year or two ago, when I would ask that question, there'd be one hand or two hands or three hands up. I think it's quite impressive how fast awareness and enthusiasm is happening for this. Sometimes it might be happening a little too fast. So I don't know if you know, but on Tuesday, Bitcoin's price got above $10,000. It is really quite striking, and I tend to think it's a little bit scary. I think it's going way too fast right now. I think we are in a speculative bubble. But these bubbles don't happen for nothing. In fact, there's a lot of work done by a theorist called Carlota Perez, who has focused on these innovation waves where bubbles actually become critical components of how innovation happens through society. And I would suggest that we are doing this because this is a fundamentally important technology. But just to be clear, if you had invested at the beginning of when it was possible to exchange Bitcoins for dollars through an online exchange, the very first one, a rather infamous one called Mt. Gox, when it was around 5 or 6 cents a Bitcoin, you'd have a 19 million% return on investment right now. So it's pretty impressive, but why? What is all the fuss about? Well, part of the problem that I think people have had in understanding what Bitcoin is that they don't actually understand what money is. And I would say I was writing about money for 20 years. I was a financial correspondent. I covered economics. I didn't understand what money was. I thought money was the thing. I thought money was either the gold that we have or the dollar note. It used to be seashells at some point. And now it's this sort of digital representation. And by the way, this digital representation well precedes Bitcoin. We've been using digital money for like 30 years, ever since banks started using computers to run the banking piece of our monetary system. None of that is money. What money is a record-keeping system. Money is a device, a tool by which we keep track of all of our balances. Who owes what, who. If you go back, look at what anthropologists have done thinking about where money came from, the traditional view of it being a solution to the problem of barter is actually wrong. It really was something that emerged as a way to keep track of the debts that people would generate amongst themselves in society. So it's a tool for the purposes of exchange. And exchange is the essence of civilization, right? How we exchange, whether it's goods and services, information. The act of interacting with each other and keeping track of how we coordinate those obligations with each other. This is what money's for. And if we keep track of that, then we can start to think about why Bitcoin matters. Because it's just a much better way of keeping track of that information. Because it's much more secure and it's not controlled by anybody. And this is a form of information that should be free. If there's ever any form of information that should be free, it's the information that is money, so that we can all use it and we can engage in exchange and build societies and build a better economy for everybody. But let's just think about this act of how we go about this exchange in the civilization building process. Well, there's two components to it, what I would say. One is that we need information and we need mechanisms for sharing information with each other, because when we gather information amongst each other, then we can decide upon what the facts are, and then we can enter into an agreement and enter into an exchange. And through history, we've gotten better and better at the information part of this. If you think of right back at the beginnings, people would just communicate one-on-one. Then you could ride a horse, and you could drive a car, eventually you could fly an airplane. And then we had the telephone, and now we have the internet. So we've effectively solved the information problem. We can get information, the physical delivery of information to each other very, very rapidly and anywhere in the world at virtually zero cost. But there's this other element to the process by which we share information and agree upon facts to forge systems of exchange. And it's trust. This photo, by the way, was taken by Joichi Ito, who's the director of the Media Lab. And when I was looking for photos that demonstrated human beings acting in a trusting way with each other, I was really happy to find that it's actually his photo. It was a complete accident that it was Joey's. But trust is this just fundamental component of civilization. We couldn't have come down from the trees and formed tribes and then villages and towns and settlements unless we had a system by which we could trust each other, that I could go off into the forest with you and hunt for berries and know that you weren't going to stab me in the back, right? Resolving trust has been an age-old challenge, and we've found all sorts of solutions for them. And as societies become more and more sophisticated, we've relied on institutions to do that. They are centralized institutions. And that's what's distinct about what Bitcoin is, because we're now moving to a decentralized mechanism for managing trust. So, in the money world, the most important form of centralized trust, institutionalized centralized trust, was established by this guy, Giovanni de' Medici. Late 15th century, the Medicis figured out that they could take double-entry bookkeeping, which was invented by the Arabs, and use it to effectively create money. Because until they could do that, The only way that a merchant in Venice could get payment from an importer in London was for one of them to find a courier that they trusted to carry the gold all the way across the seas and bring it back again. Very risky, dangerous, expensive, difficult thing to do. But once banks figured out that you could just debit one person and credit the other, and that they could be the intermediation of that trust problem between them, now we had a new form of money. We had banking money. And that's what we did. We built this fabulous system, and you know what? It created the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and the modern world. So banks, as much as we have reasons to, have some problems with banks, and I think this country might, have had their problems with them, the remarkable invention created the modern world, right? But I'll give you 2 words that describe the problem with the centralized trust model. And that is Lehman Brothers. Lehman was a centralized information problem, right? They kept control of the data. They knew where all the pieces lay. The rest of us didn't, right? That's a problem for the rest of us who relied upon these institutions to manage our money, because that's what they were doing. This was the reason the whole world fell apart, was because it wasn't just the housing crisis. It was our entire financial system. CDOs were a form of money. So the monetary system that we had was dependent upon these siloed institutions, and they controlled the information. And it's not even to suggest that Lehman Brothers was bad. I mean, it was, but it's not really the point. The point is that we shouldn't have to trust these institutions to manage this vital information that we require. But we had to, because there really was no other way. In fact, the internet gives us and gave us a way to think about this differently. But for like 20 years, people couldn't figure out how we were going to resolve this problem. Because, as I mentioned, we now can send information anywhere in the world. And since money is only information, it should just be really simple for me. That's my Twitter handle up there, and that's my mum. So she's been traveling the world with me in presentations, and she's sort of getting her own amount of fame on this. But if I wanted to send money to my mum, who lives in Perth, Australia, I could just shoot her a PDF of $1, right? Let's imagine we could create a digital form of dollars, and I could send her a PDF. Here's my $1, Mum. Well, what's to stop me from sending another $1 to somebody else? Right? And how do we check that it's not? This is the double spend problem. $1 is only good if it can't be resent. This is counterfeiting. And in the internet world, it's the easiest counterfeiting in the world, right? We know that we can duplicate and replicate everything in digital form. So this was the problem that cryptographers, these sort of cypherpunks who've been trying to create a decentralized form of money for a long time, grappled with for a long, long time. And then finally, Satoshi Nakamoto, I don't know, a guy, a woman, group of people, we don't know, right? This is the inventor of Bitcoin. He came along and he realized that the way that we would have to solve this problem, so that we're not going to have a centralized solution, we're trying to create a decentralized model here, is to have a consensus mechanism. All right? So, and in fact, this is something that everybody knew. We were going to have to find a way to have all these computers agree that the money that I had sent to my mum had been sent, and that record was true, and therefore that I couldn't resend it. But, whoops, hang on a second. I'm missing something there. Okay, but in any case, the challenge was, how are you going to establish this consensus? And in the internet world, there was another problem. It wasn't just that I could duplicate and replicate the information itself, the dollars or the bitcoins or whatever. It was that I could also create multiple versions of myself. There's a famous joke from the New Yorker cartoon back in the early 90s that said, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right? And so this idea that you can just be anybody you want to be, I could have multiple Michael Caseys, and then I could basically distort the consensus So if we think of it as a voting mechanism, I could put enough of me into the system and vote 51%, and therefore just once again go ahead and double spend. So what Satoshi Nakamoto figured out was he'll put a cost on the exercise of creating this vote, of supplying your vote to the consensus. And it was a cost of computing. So because we couldn't put money into the system, so you couldn't tax people with money, you had to tax them through computing. So he made them do this hashing function, which ties up your computing resources. So your computer grinds away and tries to find this number that the algorithm is requiring you to do, which costs computing resources, but most importantly, it also costs electricity. And that's not a big deal if it's just going to be one of you in the vote consensus, but it's a really big deal if you want to take over 51% and control the consensus. So it's a cost-based form of honesty. And this is really important. And this system works. So miners now are basically competing with each other to conduct this hashing exercise, this computing exercise. And the one that is the first to find the randomly distributed number that's part of this process is awarded Bitcoin by the algorithm. They're all using the same software, running the same software, and with that, they then move on and do the next block. This is how they're adding blocks. You heard from John earlier on talking about how blocks are formed. This was remarkable because this proof of work meant that I could no longer double spend because it would just be prohibitively expensive as this system grew and grew and got bigger and bigger. To take it over just becomes increasingly expensive. So the more valuable it becomes, the more difficult it becomes to take over. So it's a remarkably powerful system. We've now got a decentralized way to prevent the double spend problem, which means, in essence, we can create a decentralized form of money. So a big part of it is the word that everyone's thinking about, the blockchain. The blockchain, I like to make sure that I introduce people to the Bitcoin idea first, because it's very important to understand where this technology came from and the decentralization principle in which it's built. But there's a lot of focus on the blockchain as an alternative way of thinking about this, because the blockchain is a piece of the Bitcoin puzzle, and it's a very powerful piece. And John talked about it as well. I think he may have even used the same diagram. But at the end of the day, what you create is this immutable record. Is if you were to change one transaction, say 4 or 5 blocks back in history. So a block is usually, in Bitcoin at least, is every 10 minutes, and there's maybe hundreds of transactions in each block. If you were to go back 5 blocks in time, 50 minutes ago, or maybe 2 days ago, or 3 years ago, and change that one transaction, that one hash, the Merkle tree structure upon which this is built is such that it would just turn every single transaction that happened after it into gobbledygook. Every single hash changes. So it's like a red dye, one of those dye functions that they put in bank vaults to catch the robber. Like, it's immediately seen. Everyone can see that this thing has been broken. So it makes it very secure. It makes it immutable. Now, I put immutable in quotation marks because it's a relative concept. Nothing is immutable. Nothing can be completely as unbreakable. But this is about as immutable a source of record as we've ever had. Through history, we've always had historical records that are controlled by centralized institutions that the usurping dictator will come in and change to assert their power over whatever new regime they've taken charge of. That can't happen in Bitcoin. Right? This is a powerful idea. Anyway, Bitcoin, so this is the way to think about this. All the fuss around Bitcoin is that technology underlying it. We got distracted by it thinking, why is everybody obsessed with Bitcoin when it's really not necessarily a better version of the dollar because it's very volatile and it seems like it gets hacked in your wallet and it's weird, I don't understand it. So why are people excited about it? They're excited about it because it's not the point. Right? Bitcoin, the currency, the thing that these miners are being rewarded with and that you can use to pay for goods with, is just the first use case. But it's an important one because it's also the first digital asset. And that's a key concept as well that I think people need to get their heads around. A digital asset, in theory, didn't exist until Bitcoin came along. We just talked before about how anything can be replicated in the internet world. Well, the reason why before we had Spotify and streaming, when we had an iTunes and we had those songs in your, on your phones and your iPads, the reason why it says it's a license, a perpetual license, rather than the fact that you actually own it, is because there was no way to enforce the asset. The very fact that anything digital can be copied meant that we had to create digital rights management systems, and lawyers had to litigate the control and use of digital material, digital products, because you could copy them, because there wasn't such a thing as a digital asset. But now we have this scarcity function. It didn't exist before. This Bitcoin can't be replicated. A Bitcoin is a Bitcoin. It's an asset. That's a big change. And it's especially big when we can start to apply the concept to other pieces of the economy. We can attach this concept of a scarce digital asset, a token that represents that, to other things. And we'll talk about that in a moment. What's also cool about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies like it is it's programmable money. Until now, we've been using money that is really just neutral. It's kind of a universal reference that doesn't have any powers beyond that referential point. But once your money is also software, you can change it, you can tweak it, you can put rules upon it. So I like to tell people, hey, wouldn't it be great if, I've got kids about to go to college, and you're sending your kids off to college, and you want to send them some money every month to get by, but you don't want them to spend the money at the bar. You really just want that money to go on tuition and books, right? You can, with a digital token where the merchant is using the same software, you can only use it for books and tuition, and it can't be used at the bar. This idea, when you take it to a much wider and potentially more powerful use, is an incredibly powerful idea. So money now becomes a piece of our software functionality. This is a big deal. It's a big deal when you combine it with smart contracts, which is another key idea. And by the way, I don't love the word smart contracts because all my lawyer friends tell me it's a stupid word. A contract is something that exists always outside of a software world, and that these things aren't actually that smart. We've been doing these things for ages. Whenever you send money through your online bank account, you're actually entering into a smart contract as well. But in the blockchain world, it is still very significant, because what we have is the capacity to execute a contract. So this is kind of like a decentralized executable contract that means that both parties to assigning that contract can know that the terms of the contract will be executed fairly by the computers in the system when the terms and conditions are met. So imagine you have a price feed from Bloomberg telling you that the price of Apple, when it hits X, there'll be a transfer of value from my wallet to your wallet. Well, this happens, and because the money is programmable, and because it resides in this decentralized structure, which we know nobody can take over and control, we both can trust that this thing will happen fairly without either party being able to interfere in it. So that's again, a very powerful idea. You've got programmable money and smart contracts. You can apply that to the structures of how we govern our economy. And why I think it's a really big deal is because, at least for this one use case, Bitcoin solved the tragedy of the commons. That's a really big statement, so I don't like to use it lightly, and I don't suggest that we've suddenly stumbled across a utopia here that's going to solve all of our global problems. But I mean, hopefully many of you know what the tragedy of the commons is. This is Garrett Hardin came up with the term 1968, famous essay about a bunch of cow herders who basically could never figure out how they were going to govern the commons. They all wanted to protect the grassland, but they didn't trust each other to not send their cows out there to eat the thing first, and so they were incentivized to send their own cows out before the other guy and overgraze, and they would destroy the commons. The principle being that without outside government, communities cannot manage public goods because they are always incentivized, they are always self-incentivized to look after their interests first, and there's no means of trusting the other person. So that key word of trust comes up here again. So why has Bitcoin solved this? Because the commons, as you would know, is now a term that is used to apply to all forms of public goods. It's not just environmental public goods. We talk about the social media, we talk about the internet commons, information commons. In the Bitcoin world, the public ledger, the blockchain, this record that everybody relies upon, that's the commons, that's the public good. And in Bitcoin, each of those miners is selfishly mining for their own purposes, their own self-interest, and yet they are consistently working on the construction of a public good. That's what's pretty powerful to me in this. In fact, it's pretty remarkable when you think about it, because Bitcoin is so designed that you don't actually have to know who those people are. It could be ISIS mining those Bitcoin, and it doesn't matter. They are still incentivized, and the system will still drive them toward this process. Right. Another element that I want to get in here that I think is important for how we take the blockchain and this technology further is that we are in this decentralized economy, and I think it needs a decentralized trust model. So we're talking about peer-to-peer lending, we're talking about Uber, we have distributed energy systems like this one in Freiburg, Germany, and I think we heard earlier about this, I think John was talking about the cyber risks that we face and the attack on Dyn with the DNS attack. All of these Internet of Things connections are creating portals in which hackers can come in and go after these big centralized sources of data. So I think we need a different model for how we manage the trust system, and the blockchain gives us a possibility of thinking about that. And as we've been hearing all day, data is key to this new economy. And data is going to be coming at us from all sides, everywhere. Do we want Google and Amazon or IBM or MIT, for that matter, to own all of that data? I don't think we do. We want to think about ways in which data can be pushed out and controlled by institutions themselves or by entities, by individuals. And that way we create a more open, accessible economy. And the blockchain, for various ways, can help us with that. So people are now thinking, though, beyond money, because this is a system for managing records and data more effectively. And as a result, it's not just about currency. It's a whole range of other use cases. In the financial sector, we're getting a lot of banks right now who are looking at how we could use the blockchain to transfer securities without clearinghouses and all these other multiple intermediaries in the middle, and make it basically an instantaneous exchange of securities. That could cut out all sorts of downtime and savings, a lot of savings through that process. Real-time auditing. When you think about it, we have a system right now where every 3 months we go back and each of these centralized controllers of information is audited, and we sample and we look through what their records are, and the big 4 accounting firms, one of them will sign off and we'll all agree on that. And we have an entire economic model built on that. We have fund managers and brokers who are paid based on their performance on this quarterly basis, and companies stick to this rhythm. What if every single transaction we could know in real time that it is true and doesn't need to be audited anymore? People are calling this triple entry bookkeeping. So there's a debit and a credit and a third entry to this immutable blockchain. It's going to change the structure of how the whole rhythm of our financial system is going to change. A lot of jobs will be lost as well, I'm sorry to say it, but it will be a more efficient, reliable, and transparent and trustworthy system at the same time. Property registries. And so one of the biggest problems in the developing world is that people can't trust their property title records because it's being managed by potentially corrupt institutions. Well, if we place those registries, those property titles, into a blockchain environment, they become presumably better to trust. So we can unlock value. Mortgages that were not possible to give to certain homeowners who own their assets are now available because we can trust the record. People are talking about artist rights, so songs and digital photos that now become a digital record in their own right. These things can be treated like an asset. The Internet of Things, I talked about, how are we going to have all these devices transacting with each other? We can't put a bank in the middle of these deals. And identity is another big one. The idea that we might be able to prove who we are through our reputations and develop some way to prove that. And finally, supply chains. So I'm just going to quickly go through a few more slides just to show you some of the things that people are working on. I mentioned the financial system. This is just basically how complicated it is now. All these are centralized institutions within, say, a Wall Street structure. And many of them are just going to eventually go away. Right? I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow because there's an enormous amount of interest in protecting these systems. But ideally, that's just really actually a sort of a microcosm of a much bigger system. So the blockchain is different in that system because it's a distributed ledger, right? So right now, the system has a clearinghouse in the middle, and each bank is basically transferring information through that. But in a distributed ledger system, everybody keeps track of the record, and that brings an element of security to it. Right? We talked before about how the safety of distributed systems, this keeps the records safe. If the clearinghouse goes down, the entire system is destroyed. And you could substitute the word clearinghouse for Lehman Brothers here, or for the CDS market, or something like that, or Equifax. It's the same problem. Once it's distributed, we have a different security structure. Supply chains are really, the idea of applying the blockchain to supply chains is really powerful because we have the potential to maintain provenance, to check where everything has come from. And I use the example of cement here because it's actually not the recent earthquake in Mexico, but we have these places that their buildings are significantly more vulnerable than, say, those in Japan because they have got faulty cement in them. So there's no way to know down the chain of production through these suppliers whether or not somebody's been tampering with this. And the problem with that is trust. We haven't been able to share information across the supply chain because these institutions don't trust each other. But now, potentially, people are working hard on this. We have the potential to use the blockchain as a way to have all these different suppliers share information across each other so you can track, with various other processes involved, the validity of the ingredients going into each level of production. And this is also relevant to finance within supply chains. And so, I think Foxconn, the big Chinese electronics manufacturer, is doing this. They're getting all of their suppliers to use a blockchain to keep track of their inventory and keep track of their records and show in a more public way where they are in the production process. And in return, Foxconn is saying to them, if you do this and we keep track of it better, we all got greater visibility and transparency, we're going to cut your payment terms down from, say, 90 days to 30 days. So all of a sudden, Foxconn's becoming a bank. Foxconn's adding liquidity to the supply chain, and therefore it's actually basically making the bank redundant. So the idea of trade finance becomes less relevant when you can speed up transactions. But at the same time, there's also the capability for banks to take a lot more value out of this process because the documents that are being used in the supply chain, bills of lading and invoices and warehouse receipts and these things, for lots of the world's SMEs, 50% of them, they haven't been able to use those documents to get letters of credit and the typical forms of trade finance that they rely on because the banks don't trust those documents. They don't trust those documents haven't been multiple times pledged to different lenders. Whereas if we had this secure system that cannot be double pledged, cannot be replicated, there's a more secure system for collateral, and therefore banks should be able to offer more systems to it. So, one example of IoT I think is worth looking at is this idea of automated self-driving cars, and this idea of how would we deal with a congestion scenario? So these are computers. So a payment is made, and it moves automatically by itself. Oops. this is the sort of thing that could only be possible with digital money, programmable money, and programmable systems. But it makes sense. We could have a if this guy's in a hurry to get to the hospital and this guy has, agreed that these are the terms by which he would get out of the way, then why not? And if it's all managed through a very well orchestrated Google system for automated self-driving cars, then it is one way to resolve congestion and to sort of move money. But there has to be a transfer of money in the process for this thing. So you think if money starts to become, through this IoT world, part of the incentive and lubricating function of its management in a sort of a holistic sense. So part of this is the token world. We've seen ICOs. Who's heard of ICOs? Not so many, okay. Initial coin offerings, people are issuing their own tokens right now. They are multiple forms of things like Bitcoin. There are other digital currencies, and raising money out of them. And it's a bit of a wild ride right now. I tend to think it's a little out of control. But the very idea of a token within the system is pretty interesting. And so people are talking about, are we in this, another question about whether we're in a bubble or a boom, and this is the price of all these. Actually, this is outdated. It's now considerably higher than this in value. The total value of all of these extra non-Bitcoin tokens that are out there. And it may be that the price is going to collapse in all these things as well. But what's really interesting about the tokens themselves is that we think about this idea of programmable money. They become a means by which you can insert into your community a form of self-governance. So I talked about the idea of the tragedy of the commons. If you've got this community that cares about one particular issue, rather than have some government outside or some other way to manage your problems, you embed the governance into the coin itself. It starts to become a much more fluid way to create these microeconomies. And I think that's the most exciting thing about the token boom. So for example, you heard about IPFS today, the Interplanetary File System. There's a token attached to that, a thing called Filecoin. So if you're going to offer up your idle computing services to store some of the files in that system, you could be paid with this Filecoin. If you wanted to access somebody else's computer to do the same, you would pay them in Filecoin. So you create an ecosystem around this one token. I think that's another very powerful idea. But none of this is going to happen easily. There are lots of challenges. We talk about the garbage in, garbage out problem. The blockchain is only as good as the information that's going into it, right? So it's also we call it the first mile problem. How do we ensure that the data itself is being trusted? How do we scale this thing? It's actually, certainly for the most decentralized systems, not that easy to do. Transparency is critical, but it also raises privacy concerns. The blockchain is a public record. There are solutions. People are looking at very powerful zero-knowledge proof encryptions, and so we can still presumably get all the value of information from the blockchain, but not have to identify ourselves. Because the thing is, in an AI and machine learning and big data analysis world, it's actually quite easy to identify somebody just through the patterns, right? So we need to figure out ways to protect privacy in this system. There's all sorts of challenges about law and regulation because this stuff just is so different from the way we've currently structured our legal system. So there's an enormous amount of work being done around that sort of global governance thing, and standards become a part of that. And then the other biggest challenge, particularly if we're talking about these permission systems, is how do you get everyone to agree to come together and do it? So then a lot of companies are saying, I'm going to put a blockchain on this. I've got a problem. I'll blockchain it. I hate the use of it as a verb, but people are saying it. And it's not always the case that you would need one. But I think the way to go about it is to ask the question, what is the cost of trust? And trust actually turns out to be quite expensive. So a supply chain, for example, all of the management of that supply chain is difficult because of trust. And blockchains resolve trust in a way that's quite unique. And so the question needs to be drilled down quite deeply at this level. And then there's this one final issue that I think I could spend an entire other presentation on, and I'm just going to leave it hanging there. But what's happened since Bitcoin came along is this move towards kind of blockchain without Bitcoin, which you could also say is blockchain without proof of work algorithms, without a cryptocurrency in the middle as the mechanism for keeping track of it. And in some respects, it's a step backward. It's to sort of, these are called permissioned blockchains. So a permission blockchain is one where there's actually a consortium that is deciding who the validators of the network are going to be, rather than the Bitcoin model, which is anybody can do it, but you're kept honest by this proof of work system. And in some respects, it's just kind of impossible to imagine many of the existing economic models we have going to that Bitcoin system. And so with people saying, I'm going to build this permission system, we're going to have you, and you, we're all going to agree, and we're going to run this thing together. But the problem is you go back potentially to the same old problem you always had, because now you have a centralized institution. That is that permissioned entity. And that creates a whole set of other risks and everything else. That said, again, this is a challenge, and I think there's probably a continuum. There's ways to imagine permission systems which are sufficiently decentralized that risk goes away. I just think that people need to think hard about what that design is and the value of sort of at least striving for the ideal of decentralization. Whoops. And so that's me, and I'm happy to take questions if I still have time, Eduardo. And there's a book of mine coming out. I have to do a hard sell of this is coming out in February, so if you're interested in it, it's not too far away, February. The Truth Machine.
Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta. Allá, ¿alguien levantó la mano?
I'm sure that this question will just reveal my ignorance, but I've read that that cryptocurrencies can be used to launder money because the movements can't be traced. And what I'm hearing today is that it's the contrary, that China wants to use it because they can control everything. Could you please explain that?
Yeah, well, the first part was just wrong. not that you're wrong, but they're saying that assumption that was the widely held assumption, certainly when it applies to Bitcoin, was just wrong. I mean, it is a pseudonymous system, and so it doesn't have your identified name in there, but it's really pretty, you can trace it everywhere it goes, and eventually when you hop out into an identified system like our banking system, it can be seen, right? And so, yeah, we typically say to people, look, if you really want to go off and buy a whole pile of ex-Soviet Union, armaments on some black market, take a suitcase full of cash, don't use Bitcoin, you'll get caught, right? But one of the bigger concerns people have, and this is the irony of this, is in fact that Bitcoin is not private enough. Right? I mentioned that before. And so some of the most exciting work that's going into this is actually to enforce privacy into it. Not so that drug runners can launder money, but so that, for example, a bunch of banks that might want to participate in a blockchain together can do so without revealing their positions. Right? So a bank doesn't want to show what their book looks like. They want to participate and not give up all their competitive advantages. So people are now coming up with models that bring more privacy into the system, but yet still have the benefits of this public, provable record. And that's complicated cryptography that does that, but it's actually solving the biggest problem, which is the privacy problem, not the criminality. I hope that helps.
Muchas gracias, Michael. Ahora vamos a ir a la última presentación de la mañana.